I'm Nadia Taylor, Training and Exercise Manager for the Readiness Support Center. And this is Semper Gumby, a podcast about emergency management in the Corps of Engineers. We'll cover topics about disaster response and recovery, FEMA mission assignments, and Corps-specific response authorities under which we operate for things like flood fighting and coastal emergencies. Today we're going to be talking about EnvST, or the Environmental Support Team. And EnvST is a team that is part of the FFE, or Field Force Engineering Program, but we'll let our experts tell us a little bit more about that. And today we have those experts, AviNash Sood and Arlene Weiner. So AviNash, what do you do for the Corps?
First of all, on my EnvST National Program Manager, I spend about 30% of my time. In addition to that, I also work in the environmental domain for the Corps of Engineers at headquarters in Washington, D.C.
All right. And Arlene, what about you? What do you do for the Corps?
I have two jobs, actually, with the Corps. I'm a member of the 71st EnvST team, which is a forward engineering support team, and we're deployed anywhere in the world where requested. And the second part of what I do when I'm not overseas is I work for the Baltimore District as an environmental engineer. And it's with the Hazardous and Toxic Waste Group.
All right. Shout out to Baltimore. I'm from Baltimore. So guys, tell me a little bit about EnvST, the Environmental Support Team. What is this team and what does it do?
It has got four major disciplines. One is water management. The second one is waste management. The third one is environmental studies. And the last one is special waste management. When you say water management, if the soldier is stationed in a certain place, it's the responsibility of the EnvST team to find out where the resources of the water is, where is the water available, then they are responsible to bring the water from that source to the soldier. Once the soldier uses that water, then becomes the responsibility of the EnvST again to see how it can be disposed of properly. Just like we did for water, we do the same thing with the waste, with the solids, and that is called as the waste management of solids, Environmental studies is considered to make sure the environment where the soldier is sleeping, eating, is safe. Just like the air he breathes is good, the water is good, the solids are properly. So these are the main things. In addition to that, there are some solids such as batteries, tires, which is hazardous waste, hazardous radioactive waste, that is also responsibility of the environmental support team.
So wherever they have a need for some environmental aspect, whether it's water management, waste management, or some environmental study, like Avi said?
It's that, and part of the work with the EnvST team is a little bit different because we're a multidisciplinary team. So I'm the environmental engineer, but we also have a cartographer, we have a mechanical engineer, a civil structural, electrical, and then we also have an OIC, an officer in charge, and an NCOIC. And basically we get embedded with an Army unit quite often, and the missions change based on what they need.
So on a mission, when an EnvST team is deployed as either part of a FEST or a team is deployed on its own, does that happen, by the way? Can an EnvST team go out without a FEST team?
Well, it does happen, but not very often.
Okay, so say the EnvST members are out there and they are performing some kind of study or some portion of this water or waste management. Is that done at the beginning of a mission and they go away, or are these folks here the entire mission?
It happens even before even the soldier arrives to the site, So the environmental people have to be there before the fact, during the base, and at the end too. After everyone leaves, we have to return that real estate back to the host nation. So environmental people make sure that it is clean as it was taken at the early stage from them.
And sometimes I always see us as the tip of the spear a lot of times, and we'll do what they call an environmental baseline survey. So if there's a piece of property we may be considering using anywhere in the world, we don't know about it necessarily, so we have to go in and do an assessment and look it over to see how it was used previously. Will it be safe for the soldiers to go to? And if not, what changes can we recommend or can we make? Are there other options that we have that we can use? And then it's also ongoing because when you're actually at a base that's been stood up, there's always day-to-day environmental issues that come up. So part of what we can be used for is problem solving because they don't always have folks in country that can do some of the things that we can. They just have, they don't have those specialties. They have the willingness to do it, but they are not the subject matter experts. And I think that's really what we're brought in as, is the subject matter experts for all things environmental. And that's broad. It really can go from water to waste to things. It's a small city a lot of times if you look at it that way. So you have your sewage and you have wastewater, and then where does your trash go, and where does your water come from, and all the other factors that go into day-to-day living. And that's a big component of what we can help provide. So we problem solve, but we also project and try and avoid problems before they're created.
So in avoiding those problems before they're created, when you're doing an assessment, like you just said, it sounds like you work very closely or hand in hand with real estate or a contingency real estate team, support team, CREST teams. Is that correct? You guys work together to kind of find acceptable places?
Yes, and I can tell you I had a recent experience in the last couple of years in Jordan, and there were some properties that we were considering, we might need to look at to lease for various operations, some of which we can talk about and some of which we can't. So we work very closely hand in hand with the real estate folks to decide were there any showstoppers. And that's, again, a lot of what we can come in and do and say, you may have some problems here, but you can overcome them by doing A, B, and C. And by doing that, we help them determine that, yes, in fact, they might be able to use a site that, although it has problems, we can overcome the issues there.
So what are some things that you're looking for in an assessment in one of these environmental baseline studies? Study or survey?
They're both.
Study, same thing.
Yeah.
Study is same thing. First you survey it, then if you think that is good to, then a little bit more deeper study, and that's called studies, But surveys is the first line, and studies comes after that.
I can give you a good example from recent times. Went out to an area that had previously been looked at, but it didn't have an EnvST type person. They thought this property was great. I did some walking around and found a landfill that was on the site that they hadn't seen, which is a big deal. So there were drums and some oil spills and other things that all that would say to you is maybe you can use half the site, but you may want to move your boundaries a little bit for the site that you're considering. You also sometimes want to look at how close they are to a water supply. If you need water, where's the closest water? Is it clean? These are all the types of things that we can help them determine how best to use. Those are some components of the study and some of the things that we find. It's always amazing because people are like, well, what do you do when you go out there? And there's underground tanks at times, and can they be used again? We've seen water towers that haven't been used for a long time and they're filled in with trash. So on initial blush, you look at something and go, oh, there's a water tower, but you find out you can't use it because it's been compromised by either some of the local population or things that have gone on. And some of what you also have to do is to understand how things work within the host nations that we go to, because things that apply, as we'd say, CONUS or in the U.S., don't always apply overseas. So you have to be flexible enough to determine, how to make those corrections when you're out of the U.S.
So I want to get back to that, but I have to ask, how do you miss a landfill?
If a site is several acres, and maybe when you were there, you walked around the perimeter and you looked, but you didn't crisscross or do something across the entire site, which if we do a survey, we're more likely to look over the entire site and crisscross it back and forth. You can miss it. And sometimes topography will hide things. You see a bunch of trees and you don't realize that maybe some of these drums are hidden behind the trees and you just see a tree line. So it can be a simple oversight because they don't think about things sometimes the same way we do.
So it sounds like, you're talking about geology, you're talking about environmental concerns, and then you also mentioned kind of this cultural element. It sounds like it's a really multidisciplinary team and team member that is needed.
It is.
Because sometimes, especially when you go to the Middle East, there's mosques that are around in a lot of different places. You also have archaeological sites that are very well protected or need to be protected, and some are a lot more subtle than others. And when you see them, you need to recognize them for what they are to make sure they're protected. And, we talk about endangered species and birds, and there's a lot of different animals and flowers and things, depending, again, what country you're in, that you have to have at least a little bit of knowledge and determine if that's something you need to worry about on your site as well.
Now, we've talked about Jordan, we've talked about Afghanistan, we've talked about Liberia with the Ebola mission that Avi mentioned. These are all wildly disparate cultures. So how do you manage that as a deploying member of this team? How do you manage the cultural element in all of this?
Usually before you deploy, one of the requirements of your training is a cultural sensitivity. So you understand some of the cultural differences between the U.S. and that particular country so you could limit your faux pas. We also had some opportunities through the Language Institute. A few of us were interested in trying to learn a few words of the language, which I always think is a great idea because if you at least can speak a few words of someone else's language, it goes a long way.
Do you guys work with interpreters too on that note?
Yes. Again, it depends on what the mission set, but you can imagine in a technical field like engineering, you go to an Air Force base that perhaps isn't run by, there's very few U.S. folks there, and you certainly need an interpreter with you that could help explain what it is you're trying to determine too. And it's an interesting, because some interpreters are very good, but they're not technical, so we're talking in technicalese for lack of a better. So it's fun to watch at times. I think in Jordan, I drank more tea, because it's very funny. If you go there and you say, I have an hour to be at this site, if you have to meet with a commander or somebody from the post, you better add another 2 hours because culturally, as you were saying, it's an insult. So the whole team comes in and you all sit down and you drink tea.
Business comes later.
And it's really, it could be 1 to 2 hours. And then when you're done your business, they want you to stay for lunch, at times. And it's a very wonderful experience, but we are so used to keeping things moving that sometimes you have to be careful not to step on the toes of your host. And by, as you said before, understanding the culture helps you a lot more.
So beyond this cultural sensitivity training and the on-the-job training that you get when you get to a site, what other forms of training do we use to keep our teams up to speed?
On the technical side, we meet here once a year, and we train them for 1 week. It's a 40-hour course. Before
I went to Jordan, there was a possibility that we were going to be doing some humanitarian missions. And in addition to being an environmental engineer, I'm a geologist and had a little bit of experience, although not recently, with water and wells, which is a big issue. So I went to a couple-day seminar just to bolster my skills. And as it turns out, while I was there was a humanitarian need at a potential new refugee camp that they were trying to drill a well. So I met up with some of the staff who were working with the humanitarian effort and was able to go out and observe the well being drilled and participate. So some of the training that I did ahead of time was very timely. And there's other things. Once you've deployed, you begin to understand that there's certain things that can help you with your training. There's some engineering drawings called CAD drawings. And some of us as an environmental engineer, that's not my strong suit. But the whole team went for the training. But sometimes the training that you do might be outside of your field, but it gives you insight into the other people that you're working with because we have to backfill for each other sometimes. And even in doing your job, if you understand the mission of the other folks on your team, even though you're not the expert, it helps you help the whole mission. When we find things like that we need, we try to arrange for training in that particular area before we go.
So, Arlene, I know you've deployed recently in the last few years. What's a deployment like personally?
I can tell you that each one is different. The first time I deployed for a long period of time was 9 months, and I was located in a tent. And when I first saw this tent, it literally looked like a MASH tent to me. And, and I'm not as young as a lot of the soldiers. And I looked at this and said, oh, my God, I can't possibly spend the next 9 months here. And it turned out the people in that tent were phenomenal. And it was one of the best experiences that I had because you figure out it's like, we've told people it's like a minimum security prison sometimes in terms of space because you have about 50 square feet. And what becomes amazing is what you learn is how little you need. You're used to having a lot more space and there's certain adjustments that it takes. And every time you deploy, it's usually the first few weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks that are all the toughest to get your own rhythm down in terms of what you want to do because sometimes we think it's like Groundhog Day, like the movie. You get up, you're working 10, 12-hour days. If you like physical activity, you'll find a gym or some type of exercise that you like to do. You eat, you go to sleep, you start over, and maybe you watch some movies or read a book or do things. But it's an incredible learning experience because you have a new family that you sort of adopt and have to meet. And it's also figuring out how to get along with people who are sometimes very different. It's one thing when you go to work and you could come home from the different people. But when you're deployed, you're pretty much doing everything together and you're working 7 days in a row. So there really isn't a break. And it's not like you get to go someplace else, for the weekend to relax. But the most recent deployment, I was in a housing unit. They call them chews. It's a trailer. It's about 8 feet by 20 feet wide, and there's 2 of us that share that. And it was on the edge of an air base, and every night the F-16s fly over and rattle the cage that you're in. And I laugh about it now, but you do get used to it. It's amazing that you hear it, but it no longer wakes you up out of a sound sleep. And there's a lot of things you take for granted when you're home, that when you're there. And I always laugh at people and say that you can take a shower without wearing shower shoes. And people are like, what? And understanding that bathrooms and facilities could be a couple hundred feet away from where you live, and sometimes there's water shortages, so you may or may not be able to take a shower. Most times things work pretty well, but you have to be flexible enough to deal with those type of issues and not get too bent out of shape because you really can't do a whole lot about it.
Yeah, flexibility seems to be the common thread through any deployment.
Yes, it's like Semper Gumby is kind of the calling card.
Thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I know you took time out of your busy schedule during this training week, but we appreciate it. So thanks so much. That's all we have for today's episode. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you've learned something. Please subscribe to our feed and check back for future episodes. I'm Nadia Taylor, and this is Semper Gumby.